Yeah, my name is Vince Broady. I am a co-founder of GameSpot. For those of you who may not be familiar with GameSpot, it's a site on the internet that provides information about computer and video games. And so you could almost think of it a little bit as a museum of a sort for all the games that have been released across all the different platforms, really all across the globe since we started the site in 1996. And since we've been around for such a long time, we've really had the chance to chronicle, in many ways, the great work that has been done by the three gentlemen to my left. And I really encourage anyone that's interested in sort of learning more about the games and the history that these guys have made to come visit our site and check it out, because I think you'll be very impressed by the depth and quality of what you see. I'm just curious, how many people here played Myst? Okay, that's great. That's great. And how many people here played any one of the Prince of Persia games? All right, that's great. How many people finished either one of the games in either of those series? Wow, there are some dishonest people here. Well, actually, I want to say that I did. I'm a gamer. I started out playing video games as a kid and in college. I became an editor at a magazine. I reviewed the original Myst when it came out. And I finished it. I also finished the Prince of Persia games. I keep trying to finish The Sims, but they just keep adding new levels or something, and so I have to keep playing it. But when I was thinking about tonight, about graphics, for me, there was a certain turning point. I'm sure we'll address some of the big turning points that took place, but from the perspective that I was working in an online site that was providing information about games, one of the major turning points came in 1998 when a game came out from Nintendo, which was called The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And I don't know how many people here played that game or knew someone who did, but it was really beautiful. I mean, it was 3D, fast, stunning, well thought out, well executed. It was gorgeous. And as was our practice at the time, we posted 5 screenshots from that game up onto the website so that someone who was reading the review could, kind of like the back of the box, kind of see what was there. So we posted the screenshots, and the next day the guys came in, the editors, and they're like, this is incredible. We saw about 15,000 hits on those screenshots for Zelda yesterday, which was unthinkable at the time in terms of how much activity around those shots. I said, well, put up 5 more. And the next day they came in, they said, we hit 25,000 hits on Zelda. I said, well, put up 5 more. And we eventually posted 1,000 screenshots of Zelda. And I can tell you that there are hundreds of people that looked at every single one of those screenshots. That was a turning point, because that indicated that just on pure visual imagery alone, on artistic quality, to address the point earlier raised alone, the images of games had finally kind of crossed a barrier. Another thing that happened at about the same time, and I'm sure he doesn't remember this, but I do, Riven was about to come out on the PC. It was the sequel to Myst. And of course, we as a kind of young website that was trying to compete with magazines had done our best to get screenshots of Riven up on the site. And we actually got the PR department, I guess it was a Broderbund at the time, a Red Orb maybe, I can't remember, to provide us with the shots, which we very proudly, the day before the game shipped, put up onto the website in all their high-res glory. And Rand called me to let me know what a travesty it was that these images of this game, which he and his brother had poured years of their life into, were now available for anyone to see without playing the game, right? And I said, and I felt terrible about it, and I listened like this, editorial integrity. But it was really, and of course the reaction was exactly as he had feared. It was a fury around those images. And that was just another case of the images themselves becoming so powerful that they could tell a piece of the story just in a single still screenshot. Well, GameSpot's continue to post screenshots of games. We actually have about 325,000 of them in our database, up from about 20,000 different games. And you can really see the progression. And on any given day, we get about 1 million users that come to our site to get information about games. And those users generate about 20 million clicks each day on the information that we provide. And we have the best reviewers that you can possibly find, and the best previewers, and the news guys, and we have hints and tips and cheats. I mean, we have it all. But about 1 click in 3 is on a screenshot or a gameplay movie, which I think really shows that video games is a visual medium first and foremost, and that still a picture, can tell 1,000 words. Tonight, as has been mentioned, we have an incredible panel. I'm going to briefly introduce them to you, and then we'll get the evening underway. To my left first is Will Wright, Max's chief designer and co-founder. Will Wright is the creator of all things Sim. So think about SimCity and all the variations on that early sort of experiment in games that didn't actually have a discrete beginning and end, but which actually just allowed the user to kind of create a world on their own. To his left is Jordan Mechner. Jordan is the independent game designer. He's a guy that has really written his own sort of history in the industry. He started off very early on in the late 70s, I guess, beginning to program. And his credits include games like Karateka, the original Prince of Persia, The Last Express, and most recently, Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, which is a phenomenal game. And if for anyone here that hasn't picked up a game in a while and appreciates artistry and puzzles, it's just a fantastic game, so I really recommend it. He's also making films, and his short film, Chavez Ravine, A Los Angeles Story, won the 2003 IDA Distinguished Documentary Achievement Award. And then finally, all the way to my left, Rand Miller, who is a founder of Cyan. Cyan was founded in 1987 by Rand and his brother Robin. And they created a game which was called The Manhole. Again, it's almost like a misnomer to call it a game, for those of you who remember that. But it was a first entertainment product on the then new medium of CD-ROM. And that freedom from little discs and freedom to explore and create environments was really something that was emblematic of all the Cyan games, including Cosmic, Osmo, and Spelunks, and then ultimately, finally, incredibly, with Myst. So I guess my first question is, we've seen this incredible expanse of technology, of the kind of creative landscape possibilities, probably at the same time as you all three got started, and it was about the same time in the late 70s, early 80s, sort of trying to program games for money, as we discussed with Jensen earlier. There were tens of thousands of people trying. There's 3 of you left here today, right? You had to stay on top somehow of all the changes that took place on the technology side, understanding the market, and also on the creative side. It's a unique sort of set of skills. How did you, or how do you manage to do that? How do you stay at the forefront in such a competitive field? Will, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, playing games, you're looking at them right now as a passive observer, and the most apparent thing is the difference in graphics quality, let's say, over the generations of games. But as a player, still the core thing is you interacting with this system. You have a controller or joystick or whatever, and you're making decisions, and you're seeing the result of those decisions. And that fundamentally hasn't really changed that much. And most people I know that are really into games because they love games are because they enjoy that, basically that is the secret weapon that games have, is interactivity. And it doesn't really matter at some level what graphics you map on it or what interface you put in front of it. That's a very open-ended creative palette. How you do this interactive loop, this interaction between the player and the game. Getting better graphics, getting more computer horsepower, of course, enables you to go deeper, further in different directions. But I see that as the backbone on top of which you map all this massive technological change, which can then increase the creative landscape. But even back when games were back, on 8-bit systems, the creative landscape of games was huge, and it's only gotten larger. And we've only explored one little tiny corner of it over here, and we have a few established genres of games. But I just know that the space is, many orders of magnitude larger than that region that we've explored. So that's, I think, what kind of keeps me interested in it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, from the point of view of the games designer, just because the technology is better, it doesn't, the there's sort of a technology of game design as well, and that is kind of still in its infancy. In fact, it's, with each new level of innovation, like for example, when CD-ROM games came in the 90s, games took a giant step backwards in terms of how much fun they were, because suddenly you could have these full motion, long cutscenes in the games, and that kind of weighted the games down and made them a lot heavier and less fun to play than the older 8-bit games of the 80s. And again, when real-time games came in, real-time 3D, suddenly you had this problem of how do you get the player to navigate in a 3D environment? And suddenly where it was fun to navigate and easy to navigate in 2D, people were spending a lot of their time trying to aim their character and just jump into the right direction. And so it took a few years to kind of catch up with that. I mean, a good analogy might be with movies. Silent movies were really at a very high point of artistic expression, with camera work and lighting and so forth. And suddenly when the microphone came in, all the early movies from the sound era are, the camera's suddenly way back, the frames are very static, and everybody's like kind of, all the actors, you can see they're worried about making a noise that will ruin the scene. And it took movies a few years to kind of absorb that into their vocabulary as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's a trend, like a lot of people who are still around are people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps a bit. I mean, we were talking earlier, there's a lot of stuff I know that Robin and I did that we used the early stuff, the funding from the early stuff to move forward to the new stuff and to increase our skill level in this new medium, as we were going along. And it seems like we've all stayed in areas of expertise, in spite of the fact that the interactive entertainment is very diverse between the three of us. We've kind of stayed in our niches and gotten better at it as we went along. And maybe there's something to that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Speaking about that era of CD-ROMs and full motion video, I think the low point I remember was I was going to watch the making of a game, and I think it was Edward James Olmos was dressed up like as an Inca warrior, and he was saying, press here for help. And then they're like, okay, let's do it again. It's like, press here for help. And then, this went on for like a half an hour, and then they were just like, oh, this is great work. And it was sort of that lack of, interactivity, and I think it's interesting, the pre-render, the sort of imagination that the pre-render showed, and the fight, the struggle to get to the point where you can actually do those things in real time. It's such an interesting point. And I wonder, when you were starting back in those early games, when you imagined the experience, when you imagined the world, were you thinking about the images we're seeing today? Were you thinking in terms of the images you could actually create at the time? Can you describe that process of imagination and also balancing it with what was possible technologically, Rand?
Yeah, it's a great question, because from our point of view, and I guess, to what Will said, it started in our heads. And so it's, you're trying to take something out of our heads, put it on paper, document it, write it up, and then put it back into a form where you can deliver it so that the people are getting as close to what was in your head as possible. So in that regard, I don't think it matches quite what was in our heads originally, but the real Myst was actually an attempt to go there. I mean, when we designed Myst, we never thought of static screens. We were thinking we're flowing through this world. This world is real. And it messes up your design sometimes doing that, because to this very day, I go through a week of design and we come back, okay, good, that's all done, that's great. And somebody comes back to me and goes, well, okay, but wait. Did you think about the camera and this, and it's got to move here? It's like, oh, man. So it's not quite meeting what's in our heads, but it's getting closer, at least from my point of view.
I think, for me, I think very visually in a lot of ways, but when I think about games, when I have a vision in my head of the game I want to play, it's not a graphic vision, it's an interactive vision. I have a sense of the possibility space I want to navigate as a player, which, again, is kind of independent of the implementation to some degree. I remember the first time I played Myst, actually, which I loved. But, the whole time I was playing it, the one thing that kept coming back to my head is, boy, I wish I could have designed this world. I wish, I thought that, Robin and Rand must have had a great time designing that world, because it was such an inventive, creative place. And I wanted the game to be that malleable. I wanted to be as interactive enough to where I could go start designing my own buildings in that landscape. And so I think, usually I tend to think in terms of how malleable, how open-ended is the possibility space, and that's the actual thing I'm sculpting as a game designer. On top of that, then I'll say, okay, what's the appropriate graphic representation of that? And that's when it starts to res in my mind as to what the thing might actually look like. But I actually, in design, think of it as a more abstract system, as a big pile of clay. And what can the designer, do with that clay? And then how much am I going to leave unfinished for the player to go in and manipulate? I really enjoy games where I can be creative, and I try to make games that allow players to be creative as well.
Right. Did the sands of time reflect what you were thinking in your head when you did the original Prince of Persia?
No, when I did Prince 1, I could never have imagined that games would ever look that good. In fact, if I remember right, my biggest worry was that computer games were a fad that was soon going to end. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to finish the game in time. Could have been like Rubik's Cube.
Right. What goes into the images that we've seen? I mean, obviously we know you all are not drawing and coding and doing all the things necessary to bring these images to life. Well, what are the creative teams that are sort of behind the current sort of state of games? How many people are working on these things? For how long? Can you describe a little bit about what's behind the scenes from what we've seen tonight?
I think that's been the biggest change in the industry from my point of view. I mean, I think we were talking all earlier, and the very first game that probably all of us did, we were the programmer, the artist, the writer, the box copy, manual, everything. There's one person. Nowadays, for The Sims 2, for instance, we have we don't even know how many people we have on it. It's over 100. We have 17 animators, on it. It's just remarkable. And, a lot of that explosion has come on the content side.
Yeah.
The programming side has gotten more complex, and that's expanded, but nowhere near as fast as the art content and sound content. So, it's such a totally different endeavor than it was 20 years ago to make a game.
Yeah. How about to bring Uru to life? How many people? How much time?
I don't even want to think about it. It's
sorry.
Yeah, it's a monumental undertaking. I mean, it's half the battle is just finishing at this point. Honestly, I mean, there's a lot of people working a lot of long hours. This is a crazy industry. I mean, I don't know of another industry. I'm sure I just don't know of it, but where so many people are working so hard to get things done on a deadline and wrap it up and all these long hours, and then let's roll over to the next one and do it again. And back in the garage days, for example, I mean, right before Myst sold a lot of copies, but prior to that, if we sold 100,000 copies of a game, we were, that's huge. Well, those numbers are still, applicable today. 100,000 is not, it's not great, but it's okay. It's a decent game. But instead of costing, a couple 100,000 or less to do, now it's, 5 million to do a game, and you've got a team of 50 people doing it. And so it's a logistical nightmare that, to some extent, I'm glad we've taken a piece at a time, or I don't know how to just throw together a team to do it.
Any comments from you on this change? And kind of, I guess, it's going to be familiar territory if you are doing films. I mean, you'll probably have to deal with some of these same issues.
Yeah, I think the creative feeling and the pressure and the hours of video game production are a lot like a film production. But one big difference is that a video game takes 2-3 years, and a film production takes a couple of months. And people spend a lot of downtime in between projects. So yeah, it's...
part of the reason we're here tonight is to celebrate your work. Part of the reason we're here is to celebrate computer graphics and and computer games and video games. If you were to look back and remember some of the moments, I alluded to Zelda for myself earlier, turning points, great memories, things that, either sent a shiver down your spine or a tingle, in your hands, or just what were the big moments for you that you remember in terms of graphics and computer games?
Actually, Will just showed the scene from Choplifter, which that was a big turning point for me. Up until then, I'd been struggling to try to make a game that would be good enough that I could sell. And I was in high school, and all my games were copies, rip-offs of arcade games. As some of our previous speakers mentioned, I was in high school, I was not dating, and I was spending a lot of time putting quarters into Asteroids machine at the local pizza parlor. And so my first serious, big, this took maybe a year to do, and it was in machine language. It was an exact copy of Asteroids with down to the individual rocks had the same shapes as the rocks in the coin-op game. And so I finished that. I was very disappointed to find that I couldn't find a publisher for it because Atari had begun to threaten publishers that were selling unauthorized copies of their games. So I did another game that was like one step removed from Asteroids. It was called Death Bounce. And the difference was that instead of rocks, you had round colored balls, and instead of wrapping around the edges of the screen, they bounced. And you were still in a triangular spaceship trying to shoot them all. And I sent this to Doug Carlston at Broady Software, who's in the audience today. And Doug very kindly, they turned down this project, but Doug called me to say that he thought that the industry was taking a kind of a different direction, and that triangles shooting at circles was no longer the absolute cutting edge. And so he and he sent me a copy of Broadband's latest game, Choplifter, and I was blown away by those little guys that waved. First of all, because they were human, because of the emotion and the storytelling that was in that. I actually felt guilty when I squashed them with my rotor blades. But the other thing was that this Choplifter didn't have the structure of an arcade game. That is, every other game I'd seen had, you had to, shoot until somebody killed you and you died, and then you had to put in more quarters to get more lives. And after 3 deaths, the game was over. But it was structured so that you could keep playing forever, and that was obviously a way to use up your roll of quarters and make you go and get another roll so that you would keep playing all night long. But, when I saw Choplifter, where it was actually possible to save all of the hostages and get a perfect score, and then the words "the end" appeared on the screen. Not game over, but the end. That blew me away because, of course, because when you are programming a game for a computer, your audience is people who own the machine, and they've bought the game. They paid $40 for it. It's theirs. You don't need to suck quarters out of them. So you can create any kind of experience you want. You don't have to addict them for the purpose of getting more quarters out of them. So that gave rise to Karateka.
Rand, you want to take that?
Well, the earliest influences weren't graphic at all. The early Zork games were, they made me feel like I was someplace. It was, all imagination to some extent. It was all built in my head, but it built worlds that seemed like they were somewhere. So much so that I remember having a conversation with people the next day who were playing at the same time, going, "Oh yeah, I went down this place," and and describing this story of what I had done, and people overhearing it saying, "What are you talking about?" But it was that real, and I think if I had to pick out other particular aspects of graphics, these are going to seem odd, but Battlezone, once again, really raw graphics, but it felt that 3D was enamoring to me. That real-time 3D was enamoring. Vector graphics or not, it seemed like a place I could drive around and explore. And then one that kind of shocked me, maybe I'd grown complacent, was Mario 3D. Because if somebody had asked me if you could do that, or let's build a real-time 3D of the camera that moves around, a guy would go, "No, that's too hard," and so it shocked me a bit. It's like people can do that. Don't set the bar too low.
Will?
I think one of my big inspirations was actually Mac Paint. I love the interface of that and the fact that it felt like you were dealing with something tangible. And in fact, I roughly mirrored that in the original SimCity. Basically you had a tool palette, and I treated the landscape as the painting surface, and all the the road building, zoning as painting tools, because it felt like it was such a natural metaphor for people to kind of come into it. And it also kind of told you it was an open-ended creative experience, and the rough metaphor was a paint program. Manhole. I remember having a really deep impact on me. I had a daughter that was like the perfect age for the game, and so when you were showing those clips, I remembered that I remember almost every line in that game, every little rhyme I can recite to you right now if you want to hear it, but I'll spare you that. But there was one particular spot in Manhole where you come up and it's nighttime and the crickets are chirping, and it has the ambience of this warm summer night, and it was amazing. This is black and white graphics, and the sound effects were carrying at least half the experience. And most of the screen you were like in a dark forest, but the sound effects were so evocative, and the graphics were just enough to support that I could really close my eyes even and imagine myself being there. And I was amazed at how powerful that was, in terms of a very kind of simple amount of presentation that was being sent to me, but it was evoking this kind of deep, almost emotional feeling of being a kid, out in the woods, on a warm summer night. Wolfenstein 3D, I think, was one of the first games that really scared me.
And that's how I felt about Doom.
Doom was pretty close. Walking around the corner, all of a sudden the guys are you drop the mouse and run out of the room. Yeah, especially if you turn the lights down in the room when you're playing it.
Yeah.
More recently, Zelda, Wind Waker, which is I showed the slide from earlier. I've been very intrigued with that game. If you see screenshots of it, it doesn't do it justice. You look, it looks like a cartoon when you see static screenshots. When you're playing it, though, the artistic expression of the graphics is utterly amazing. The way smoke and waves and all the environmental effects work in the game are almost like woodblock prints. And so it's like he took, Miyamoto-san took a 3D world and then kind of reinterpreted it with a very artistic flair rather than trying to replicate the physics of a camera. And I found that very inspirational in terms of where graphics can go from photorealism.
Yeah, I think those are all great examples. One other one I would mention that struck me was the original Sega NFL 2K football game, which I don't know how many people had this experience at the squint test, where if you just squinted and you watched the players walking around the screen, you saw them break the huddle and pat each other on the butt as they walked back. I mean, it was just almost real. And I think that was the first time I really felt like we were going to get there. Or really believed it could actually happen, that we could have games that approched
I didn't realize other people did the squint test.
Yeah, I know.
Wow. Okay, I feel more normal
almost looks real right now.
Yeah.
But I think that issue of photorealism, which you alluded to in your presentation, about what happens once you achieve reality. And I remember, I think it was Claude Leglise at Intel talking in the mid-90s, and they had Intel, and they probably someone here knows the resolution and optical sort of definition of the color depth and pixel depth of human vision. He was talking about, we're going to get there. And it seems like now we actually can, not only are going to get there theoretically someday, but we're really going to get there soon. What happens, in your opinion, you kind of talked about it, but what do you all think about this post-photorealistic era that we're about to enter? How is it going to change the way that you think about games and design games?
Well, it seems like movies have had photorealism for quite a while, and you still have bad movies. I'm not sure I equate photorealism with a good game. I think it's a very powerful tool, in the palette of things that a game designer might want to use. I'm actually kind of more excited by, having the flexibility to push the graphics in different kind of interpretive directions.
Yep.
When everybody's kind of running for this one target, I've generally wanted to kind of turn away from that target and head for somewhere else, because we are dealing with a huge unexplored space. And up to now, photorealism, has seemed like this major attractor in the space, and I think at some point we're going to realize it's a local, maxima, and that there are possibly other more interesting things we can do with graphics that will still require probably a lot of graphics processing and power. But I'm not sure if photorealism to me equals good gaming.
It doesn't equal good games, and it actually makes it harder by bringing all the other aspects into sharp relief. Like the example that Will gave, if you've got a character who looks almost photorealistic, but he's behaving, like a wooden automaton, that's kind of creepy. It's better to have a character that looks like a cartoon, because then his behavior seems lifelike.
Yep.
By comparison.
Well, I think photorealism makes great games.
Okay.
Yes.
Just kidding. I have to say that I think that there's got to be other people who have other areas of interest, like we did. That I touched on this before, but I think they've got stronger tools at their disposal. There's got to be a crop of kids who grew up playing these games, and they're interested in other things than we are, and they're going to interpret their interest in interactive gaming using the existing crop of photorealistic tools in some amazing ways. It's hard to step out of what we've become good at. Maybe a whole other group of people will use the tools in a different way.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because the story you told. I mean, I started remembering it. When you brought it up, I hadn't up till that point. Sorry, didn't mean to scream.
That's better, actually.
But we talk about this often. In our game, the reward is the photorealistic graphics. I mean, the game design. People are entertained in a lot of different ways. but and we always talk about game systems, but even in normal life, there's everything from football to to movies to blackjack to magicians, and a lot of different ways to be entertained. But part of what we've done is making those photorealistic images part of the reward of playing our game. It's not so when you see them, it's always been a touchy situation with marketing departments. Every publisher we've worked with is, we got to show images. We're like, no, because they have to wonder what's around the next corner. We use those as our carrot.
Right.
So it's a little more. We rely on that maybe a little bit more than other people who have game systems that are more intricate.
Yeah.
Well, like with what you do, it's almost like there's a surrealist dimension to it, that because it's rendered photorealistically, but yet it's this surreal environment. I mean, you're going off in a different creative direction, and the photorealistic rendering is actually supporting the environment, making it even seem more surreal.
Yeah, I mean, you really bypassed the photorealistic trap I was talking about, too, as first by having the environments be so artistically expressive, but also because the focus is on the environment. It's not on people.
Yeah. I actually agree. I was not serious about the photorealism makes great stuff. But, but we do, I mean, we have tried to one of the things we've always fought with is trying to build interesting things using the tool not just to build photos. And I think that's what Will was getting at, is if you're just going to make photos, who cares? But if you've got this tool at your disposal, use it creatively, either in the things that you build or in what you're saying now, even in some it's like a jazz music comparison. I mean, you start to play with those photorealistic renderings in ways that now that you're good at it, in ways that people are unexpected.
So maybe realism is almost more of a benchmark. It's something that we can always kind of measure our performance against and kind of use that as the starting point for the creative expression. Right. And over the years, we've seen kind of the slow ratcheting of that benchmark.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still shooting for true photorealism in real time. I mean, we still have this bar set that once we cross that, we'll be there. We're almost there.
Yeah, but once you get there, do you think there's going to be like a discrete state change in your game quality or what you do, or is it just going to be like, okay, now you don't have to worry about that, now you can kind of spend more time on the creative side?
Yeah. Well, I think actually along those lines, we showed the footage tonight. There was the one disclaimer about pre-rendering. There were no disclaimers about the graphical content of what was going to be on the screen, and no one had to be escorted out of the room because the images were too violent or too adult, situation oriented. We saw the image of the hot tub in Sims 2.
Yeah.
We have this incredible increase in graphic quality. You put the two together, and with mature themes, it seems like we're entering a different sort of stage. Can you just comment on your thoughts on what to represent, how well to represent it, and for how much?
That's a big issue. I mean, it's so wrapped up in our culture because there is this kind of chasm, I think, generationally between people who play games and people who are fairly ignorant of games and don't consume them. And it generally falls on generational lines. And so you have a lot of parents that don't play games with kids that do play games. And games are still perceived in some ways in our culture as a kid's medium.
Yeah.
And so when you start doing more adult-oriented games, you're still likely to get a lot of backlash in America, even though there are plenty of adult, books and movies and television shows.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one aspect. It kind of plays. I don't think graphics has a big role in that debate. It's not a really big issue, except in the fact that I think we are poised to, actually build games that would appeal to a more mature audience now. They don't have to look like cartoons. They can, we can actually build something that would be as expressively, creatively wide-ranging as a good book or a movie.
Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, movies have been photorealistic for a long time, and the challenge is to present sex and violence and adult themes in a way that kind of connects with our imagination without being overly explicit. So I think that, again, the more photorealistic games are, the harder that gets. The Prince of Persia clip is a good example because in the first game, when the guard got back into the slicer and chopped and there was a blood smear, everybody laughed. It was funny, it was charming, it didn't offend anybody. But if you did that exact same scene today with real-time 3D, it gives a different response. It's upsetting. And so if you don't want your game to be upsetting, if you want to capture that same kind of just pure adventurous fun where you're depicting violence but in a way that it doesn't seem violent, you have to find ways around the realism in order to get back there again.
Yeah, I mean, the broader issue is there's just more responsibility on game developers. This is a crazy issue, but it gets to be a moral issue at some level, I guess. I think that that what we're using is a tool that's powerful, and powerful tools have a great ability to affect people emotionally. And historically, we use those tools to teach. I mean, there's all kinds of death in historical writings, but it's usually associated with some lesson to be learned. So if you use the tools now frivolously, without anything learned, without saying anything, teaching people about the world or themselves, then you got to up the bar the next time to try and make a point, or for them to learn something to emotionally to associate. And so the more real they get, the more responsibility there is to kind of use those tools, in what I would consider an artistic way, in that regard.
We talked a lot about the sort of design and sort of emotional elements of graphics. So just shifting gears for a second to the technology, to as obviously you've seen all the changes. I mean, if you think about someone like NVIDIA tonight and the stuff that they're putting sort of at your disposal, and the things that they are not yet putting at your disposal that you would like to have. Can you comment on what would, from a designer's perspective, from the master designer's perspective, what direction, if any, would you like to see the hardware move in? And I'm sure you're going to comment on this to different degrees, but I'm just curious, what's the technology not quite doing that you would like it to? Rand and all.
Well, I have mixed emotions on this one. And the geek side of me says, more. And the guy
more what?
I mean, just more, better, faster, prettier,
smaller,
effects, everything. I mean, just wow me. But the guy who's actually trying to shoot for the moving target says, stop. I mean, it's the hardest thing in this industry, is having to pick years ahead of time what the card is you're going to support, and how many people will have it, and it's difficult. So I'm constantly torn between bigger, better, faster, and stop. Let me just do this one well. I don't have a good answer. It's a good discussion.
Jordan, do you have any thoughts?
Although
on that?
Personally, I want bigger, better, faster. I mean, I got to say, at home on my computer, if I'm not designing them, then give me bigger, better, faster.
I guess I'm kind of more of the stop already school. I mean, every new console generation of hardware, it takes us years to really use it and make games that are worthy of it. And by then, it's already on to the next generation. We have to start all over again. So,
yeah. Will, anything you look for, or would dream about, or wish was there?
It's hard for me to think in those terms, because I tend to want to think from the inside out of the game. One thing I really want is to give the players more creative expression within the game.
Yeah.
And so, right now we are spending a huge amount creating, static content that we fill up a CD-ROM with and then ship with the game. I'm interested kind of at a very deep level, and I think this is potentially a very big trend in the not-too-distant future of heading towards what I call procedural content, or algorithmic content. And this is, rather than having a lot of static content that we have a team of artists create and then ship with the game, find ways to create the content on the fly, and make it very malleable, and also give the players very leveraged tools to create that content. Whether it be graphic content, objects, characters, environments, sound content, music, whatever. How can we make more of that procedural and algorithmic so that we can actually, on the fly, create the world as the player moves around, and we can create the world completely unique to that player, and give, and as a result of that, give the player a much wider range of choices, a much more open-ended game. The main thing that's really limiting how open-ended these game spaces are right now is the content battle that we currently have to fight. How many artists do we have to hire to build this world, and then how much experience, how many verbs can we then program into the world?
Right.
The more we can make that entire process algorithmic, the more this experience opens up to like this limitless kind of universe of experiences a person can have in a game.
Right. So you don't have to think about every single little blade of grass or every leaf or every sort of puff of dust, but you can sort of have those elements, those building blocks, which can then be sort of put together in response to the user versus having to be sort of well thought out and planned in advance.
Yeah, you can take any piece of content in a game and imagine an algorithmic solution to it, or also, a way that the player could customize that object or thing. There's this group in Europe called the Demo Scene, that make these very elaborate demos for a computer that fit in very tiny little memory blocks, like 64K of memory, and you run the thing, and in fact, it algorithmically generates about 100 megabytes of data, these rich 3D environments, generated music, generated wave files, generated animation, and they're developing techniques to generate, huge amounts of interesting data out of very, very simple, elegant little compressed algorithms. And this is a skill that game developers used to have, back in the 8-bit days. That was the only way to do a game like Karateka, was to find all these little tips and tricks to compress things and generate them algorithmically. But since the CD-ROM came out, and very cheap hard drives, storage is cheap. So basically, we've lost that skill set, and now we attack all these problems with brute force. I think we've lost something by kind of dropping that skill set.
That's actually interesting. I mean, there's a certain level of debate there, and maybe it's not debate; it's just it's a transition, because in many ways, that would be something that we plant every little blade of grass. Let me just put it that way. I mean, that's what we do well. It's not because we want to; it's because to some level, if it's the algorithms to date have not satisfied us. And so in many ways, that's one of the things that I'd look for is, man, I could use some algorithms that would help us along the way doing things so that, I don't have to do meticulous stuff. But I got guys in the office who are putting rocks in places, in particular.
Well, for anything, it's always a cost benefit, right? So you can say, okay, maybe the world looks a little less, detailed, a little less realistic. Yeah. But at the same time, we can now let the player walk anywhere. We don't have to have a static map. And so I think if you start looking at the cost benefits of that, there will be a lot of cases where that cost is lower than the benefit. But I don't see the game industry really looking in that direction. Basically we're figuring out how do we hire more artists? How do we have them do more polygons per model? Which feels to me like we're kind of going the wrong direction.
Well, it seems like it's got to be a mixture of the two. You're going to have to jump in here anytime. Go back and forth on you. Because if you go all the way algorithmically, it seems like you get a lot of space that may not be quite as interesting to explore. And if you go all the way our way, it's like there's no way you can build the worlds that people, you can't keep up with people exploring through them. In our particular case. So something.
Right. Well, you bring a lot of art to that world building. So, that would be a really, really interesting thing to look at is, could you imagine, building an expert system for your creative process in world building? And how might you formalize that, into some system?
Right. That's the kind of stuff that would excite me, past the, when I reach the photorealistic level, and it's like, okay, now we can do real-time photorealism. That realism, that's the kind of stuff that's like, wow.
Or even like storytelling like Jordan does. There's this kind of idea of procedural storytelling, that might be generated.
I think the answer to your question really gets down to, for each game, where is the fun in that game? Where's the joy for the player? And does boosting the hardware increase that joy? And it can in different ways. You have here 3 totally different kinds of games. For one of Will's games, if you can have more calculation going on, creating that world on the fly, that makes the game deeper, richer, more fun. And for a game that that's an expression of a world that you've created, it can be that much more beautiful and so forth. For my kind of storytelling action game, it's the main benefit to having better graphics is that you can have a more cinematic presentation. You can have like an entire army on the screen in real time instead of just having 4 soldiers and finding a way to make that look like an army. But at the same time, that also poses new challenges, because if the fun of the game revolves around the player controlling in real time his own acrobatic movements, then the more realistic that world gets, the more difficult it gets, because it's if you've got to think, because you've only got so many buttons on the controller. The controllers are not getting sophisticated at the same rate that the graphics are. So if you've got this beautiful photorealistic world, you start to say, well, where's the door? Yeah. Because in a really schematic game, all the doors look like hexagons and they're all red. So when you see one, you're like, there it is, I'm going to go straight for it. But if you're trying to do a photorealistic palace, you start having, your job gets more difficult.
Yeah. I think it also gets to the question of just design in general, about the open-endedness, the player-created experience versus the story-told, planned experience. And there is a real merit to both. They both have value. And to your point about realism, I thought, when Flight Simulator got to the point that he had to be a pilot to use it, that was like the end of the road for me with that. So we're here tonight. This is the last question I'm going to ask. We're in this historical setting. We've all had a chance to see the machines and the technology of the past. Maybe just talk a little bit about the technology of the future. subject is graphics. We've talked about what's likely to happen on the screens as we know them today. It seems at some point the logical progression is beyond the flat screen that we currently use today. Can you just talk for a minute about will we really get to a different place as far as 3D experiences that go beyond a flat screen? And do you expect that in your lifetime? Do you expect to be making games for a truly sort of holographic style world? I'll start with Rand.
Yeah, the biggest issue for me now on that is just implementing it without putting something on your head. I think real 3D makes things come alive. If you ever looked we've created for all of our games, the little visual viewers, taking the side-by-side pictures and put them up there. And we show them to people, and their first response is, whoa. I mean, there's something that just brings it to life. So it's just a matter of the interface becoming not so obnoxious. And I think we're on the edge of that. It seems like, I hear about this stuff. I haven't seen it yet. So it seems like a natural progression.
Jordan?
Yeah, well, there is one track that's going towards virtual reality, the kind of immersive world where you put on a helmet and you don't have to use a controller. You can just kind of move your arms or maybe just move your eyes. And is that a game? I don't know. And I don't think that's going to be the only path that games develop on too. I do think we will get there in our lifetimes. I don't know if it's going to be fun in the way that games are fun. I think it might be kind of creepy and addictive in a totally different way that society is going to have to grapple with.
Well, you got the last word on this.
For me, computer graphics in games are already beyond where I thought they would be in my lifetime when I started in computer games. And what that, to me, it just kind of highlights more and more the asymmetry between the output side of the computer versus the input side. I feel like I'm able to flow plenty of information out to the user. In fact, probably something like several 100 million bits per second of data I can push out of the screen into the user, out of the speakers, while at the same time I can only measure maybe a few hundred bytes per second as input. I would much rather figure out how to bring that, those two things into more symmetry, because I think, the further they get apart, the more I feel the pain of wanting to be able to read more of what the user is trying to tell me. And have them be able to gesture in the world, be able to talk to the computer, be able to read their facial expressions, their emotional body language. To me, that would just be so vastly more valuable. And the computer graphics have just blown me away how quickly they progressed. Much faster than I ever thought they would.
Well, that seems as appropriate a note as any to end our discussion. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank you. You made it easy for us to share what's happened. That's good. I never heard that before. And I'm going to ask